Good afternoon. Is that too loud? Okay. Good afternoon. How's that? Okay. I'm Jay Williams, and I'm going to be reading today from Frank Bruni's new book called The Age of Grievance. Um, I read this book initially because Frank was my next door neighbor before we moved to the forest, so we talked a lot about these kinds of things. But I decided to read from it today because it just seems so timely in light of our very divided political climate. And I, like most of you, I imagine, have family and friends whose political um, ideas are pretty much antithetical to my own. So I'm always on the lookout for something I can read that might help me understand how on earth they come up with these crazy ideas. Um, the book is about the growing number of privileged public figures who claim that they are treated unfairly and who appeal to their constituencies by claiming that they too have been treated unfairly. Most of the examples Frank discusses are already well known to most of you through the news. Of course, there's Donald Trump and his insistence that he's been treated unfairly by the press and the judiciary. Tucker Carlson and Josh Hawley, who insist that manhood is under attack in America, and Harry and Meghan with their tour to tell the world how hard their life as members of the royal family are, and so on and so forth. But to me, the most interesting part of the book, and the part that I will be reading from, is the final chapter in which Bruni proposes some partial solutions to the problem of grievance. It's called The Antidote. I warn my students at the start of every semester, on the first day of every course, I confess to certain passions and quirks and tell them to be ready. I'm a stickler for correct grammar, spelling, and the like, so if they don't have it in them to care about it and patrol for such errors, they probably won't end up with the grade they're after. I want to hear everyone's voice. I tell them that too. But I don't want to hear anybody's voice so often and so loudly that the other voices don't have a chance. And I'm going to repeat one phrase more often than any other. It's complicated. They'll become familiar with that. They may even become bored with it. I'll sometimes say it when we're discussing the roots and branches of a social ill, the motivation of public and private actors, and a whole lot else. And that's because I'm standing before them not as an ambassador of certainty or a font of unassailable verities, but as an emissary of doubt. I want to give them intelligent questions, not final answers. I want to teach them how much they have to learn and how much they will always have to learn. I'd been delivering that spiel for more than 2 years before I realized that each component of it was about the same quality: humility. The grammar and spelling bit was about surrendering to an established and easily understood way of doing things that eschewed wild individualism in favor of a common mode of communication. It showed respect for tradition, which is a force that binds us, a folding of the self into a greater whole. The voices bit, well, that's obvious. It's a reminder that we share the stage of our communities, our countries, our worlds with many other actors, and should thus conduct ourselves in a manner that recognizes that. And It's Complicated is a bulwark against arrogance, absolutism, purity, zeal. I'd also been delivering that spiel for more than 2 years before I realized that humility is the antidote to grievance. The January 6th insurrectionists were delusional, frenzied, savage. Above all, they were unhumble. They decided that they held the truth no matter all the evidence to the contrary. They couldn't accept that their preference for one presidential candidate over another could possibly put them in the minority. Or perhaps a few of them just reasoned that if it did, then everybody else was too misguided to matter. They elevated how they viewed the world and what they wanted over tradition, institutional stability, law, and order. Party leaders who consent to end gerrymandering are humble about what they can and can't predict about their future dominance and humble in their exercise of power. They're recognizing that there are issues bigger than the magnitude of their present spoils. Politicians who re-examine the necessity of a college degree are humbly compensating for our tendencies to extrapolate from our own backgrounds and success stories to what works best in the broad and diverse world beyond us. And people who attend bridge building exercises, whether in the halls of Congress or in the hills of Appalachia, are humbly making an extra effort to understand strangers with whom they don't usually meet, and humbly accepting that civic repair is worth a personal investment of time and energy. They're the antonyms of the insurrectionists. Humility comes up often in Jonathan Rauch's superb 2021 book, The Constitution of Knowledge, a contemplation of truth and exhortation for free speech in the age of grievance. Rauch, a scholar at the Brookings Institution, defines the term in his book's title as a global network of reality-based institutions, universities, reputable media outlets, courts of law, scientific organizations that are committed to finding truth through a structured process of conflict and debate. They are liberalism's epistemic operating system, our social rules for turning disagreement into knowledge. Rauch wrote, noting that the defense of the reality-based world against a rising tide of purposeful disinformation and a sea of trolls is a constant struggle. It demands much of us, including, perhaps most important, intellectual humility, or what he calls fallibilism, the ethos that any one of us might be wrong, and we must therefore keep ourselves open to contradictory views and evidence. Being open to criticism requires humility and forbearance and toleration, Rauch explained. Scientists, journalists, lawyers, intelligence analysts all accept fallibilism and empiricism in principle, even when they behave pig-headedly, as happens with humans. Scientific findings can be replicated or refuted by new experiments. Laws can be challenged through freshly discovered evidence and refined arguments. Journalists ideally keep digging toward a deeper and more nuanced comprehension of events. That's the nature of the Constitution of Knowledge. It's a shared endeavor, an evolving quasi-document. Its nature an acknowledgement that no one person holds all the answers or cards. Its health and growth are dependent on most people accepting that. Intellectual humility allows us to revisit our assumptions, and the necessity of that is proven by how often we've been wrong or wrong-headed. Scientific racism, for example, was a rage in progressive circles in the early 1900s. In the 1990s, the global march for democracy looked inevitable as much of the political establishment, a thinking emblemized in Francis Fukuyama's premature elegy to history. On both fronts, we now know better. And we know better because we weren't arrogantly stuck in our thinking. In his book, Rauch, who is gay, recalled the near unanimity with which the political leaders once denounced homosexuality, as did, I should volunteer, major news organizations such as the New York Times. In the 1950s, 1960s, and even into the 1970s, not until 1973 did the American Psychiatric Association remove homosexuality from its official compendium of mental disorders. That all seems, well, bonkers to most of us now, even given the rightward movement of most of the Republican Party over the past decade. 39 House Republicans joined all House Democrats to ensure the December 2022 passage of legislation to safeguard same-sex marriage nationwide. And 12 Senate Republicans joined their Democratic colleagues to give that measure a filibuster-proof majority in the Senate. As recently as 1996, bipartisan majorities in both chambers had passed legislation that did the opposite, denouncing same-sex marriage. To be grounded in truth is, paradoxically, to remain open to the idea that the understanding of truth may need to shift as we learn more, and some of those lessons lay bare our prejudice and ignorance. You must assume your own and everyone else's fallibility, and you must hunt for your own and others' errors, even if you are confident you are right, Rausch wrote. Otherwise, you are not reality-based. His you is a universal one, a caution and a summons to various stakeholders. We need humility in our political leaders. The Times column that I wrote for the weekend of Trump's inauguration in January 2017 took into account the peculiarities of the pitch that he'd made to American voters, "I alone can fix it," the trademark of his showman meets conman personality, and the actual text of his inauguration remarks, in which I noticed something telling. The word humbled, which had been present in the first inaugural remarks of both Barack Obama and George W. Bush, was nowhere to be found, nor were any of its variants. That whole sentiment and politesse were missing, as they had been during a campaign centered around his supposed omniscience. "The president who buried humility" was the headline I affixed to that column, in which I observed that Trump was a braggart beyond his predecessors in the Oval Office, and that says something sad and scary about the country that elected him and the kind of leader he's likely to be. With Trump, we enter a new age of arrogance. He's the cock crowing at the dawn. With any luck, he'll soon be warbling meekly at the dusk, but he'll have done his damage regardless by sending the message to Americans that triumph is an individual act, that winning redeems whatever ruthlessness and cheating it required, and that strength is figuring out how to bend the world to your advantage and not being troubled by anything so prissy as rules and rectitude. There are now many Trumps aplenty in American politics, but anti-Trumps will be our salvation. And I make that statement not along partisan or ideological lines. I make it along the lines of character, and even more so of how a society holds itself together. It does that with concern for the common good, with respect for the institutions and procedures that protect that, and with political leaders who ideally embody those traits or at least promote them. Earlier, I mentioned Charlie Baker, the former Massachusetts governor, citing his durable popularity as a moderate Republican in a Democratic state. Something else about him has always piqued my curiosity and drawn my attention, and perhaps it's intertwined with that popularity. He repeatedly stresses the importance of humility in an effective leader. He's fond of quoting Philippians chapter 2, verse 3. He invoked it as his lodestar for his administration. Do nothing out of selfish ambition or vain conceit, it says. Rather, in humility, value others above yourself. That's great practical advice for anyone in government where almost everything is teamwork, almost everything is consensus, and almost nothing of real and lasting consequence is accomplished alone. Governing, as opposed to demagoguery, is about earning others' trust, commitment, and cooperation. Exhibiting an interest and a willingness to listen to and to hear them goes a long way toward that. It's a demonstration of humility. Insight and knowledge comes from curiosity and humility, Baker wrote in his 2022 book, Results, whose co author was his chief of staff, Steve Kadish, a Democrat. Snap judgments about people or ideas are fueled by arrogance and conceit. They create blind spots and missed opportunities. Good ideas and interesting ways to accomplish goals in public life exist all over the place if you have the will, the curiosity, and the humility to find them. Humility was also something that Bill Haslam, the former two-term governor of Tennessee, extolled. He's a Republican who ran a predominantly Republican state, so humility wasn't an attribute that aided a necessary appeal across the partisan divide. But he deemed it essential to making the changes in Tennesseans' lives that he'd pledged to make, to avoiding any prideful attachment to his first blush ideas, and a schedule of glitzy appearances and Fox News interviews that would have stolen time and energy from problem solving. He indeed amassed a record of substantive accomplishments that was impressive in its heft and its occasional deviations from conservative orthodoxies. He made community college free for Tennesseans. He cut taxes on food while raising them on gasoline. He vetoed culture war distractions, such as a bill to make the Bible the official state book of Tennessee. A few years after leaving office in 2019, he wrote a reflection on leadership. Humble leadership? Yes, and humility can restore trust. For The Catalyst, a journal published by the Bush Institute. Humble leaders who can admit fault are key to uniting a nation, read an italicized precede to his essay. Haslam's opening line, "It has been said that those who seek the high road of humility in politics will never run into a traffic jam." His closing one, "And think how much better served we are by leaders who have the humility to want to get the best answer, not just their own answer." Humble politicians don't insist on one-size-fits-all answers when those aren't necessary as a matter of basic rights and fundamental justice. And in a society like ours now, when there's scant trust between partisans and when resentment toward political opponents runs high, both parties should consider devolving power to the state and local levels when possible. Republicans have traditionally supported that in theory and then routinely contradicted themselves in an unhumble fashion when that suited them. They should do better at living their stated principles about local control. And Democrats shouldn't be so quick to assume that local control equals a reckless opportunity to wriggle free from federal safeguards. In some of the blue cities within red or purple states, local control would mean more respect and freedom for aggrieved people whose progressive ideals are squashed at the state house, just as it would mean more respect and freedom for the aggrieved rural denizens of blue states. In my home state of North Carolina, where Republicans have maintained a big majority and sometimes contrived a supermajority in both chambers of the state legislature through gerrymandered districts, they've prevented local officials in places such as Durham from enacting the sorts of gun safety and environmental measures that an overwhelming majority of the city's hundreds of thousands of citizens want. To what end? The preemption of local laws by broad state edicts has been on the rise in recent years, and it's a trend that intensifies grievance. We need humility in ourselves. We carry wounds, and some of us carry wounds much more numerous and much graver than others. We confront obstacles, and some are unfairly big, unjustly unyielding, and especially senseless. We must tend to those wounds. We must push hard at those obstacles. But we mustn't treat every wound, every obstacle, as some cosmic outrage or mortal danger. We mustn't lose sight of the struggle, imperfection, and randomness of life. We mustn't overstate our vulnerability and exaggerate our due. That's part of what Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff are saying when they lament the safetyism of contemporary education, the increasingly absurd demand that students be insulated from unkind words, troubling ideas, and all other manner of unpleasantness. The insulation is more than a roadblock to a robust, real education. It gives excessive power to those words and ideas, and that unpleasantness creates an unreal expectation that they can be kept at bay and sets up young Americans to feel aggrieved, victimized when that doesn't happen. The new protectiveness may be teaching students to think pathologically, they wrote in an article in The Atlantic that preceded and grew into their bestseller, The Coddling of the American Mind. Lisa Damour, a prominent clinical psychologist who works with teenagers, has also sounded the alarm about pathologizing normal everyday hardship. Much of the time, the presence of distress, the experience of distress, is evidence of mental health. Damour told my Times colleague Ezra Klein in a May 2023 interview for his podcast. What I mean by that is that there are lots of circumstances in daily life where we fully expect to see distress. Treating perfectly rational emotions as psychological emergencies and unfair burdens can set a dangerous precedent. And Damour emphasized the importance of not getting carried away with our natural and understandable instincts to protect young people from grief and pain. There's something kind of extraordinary about how much maturation arrives as a function of them actually grappling with a very painful feeling, she told Klein. They become more broad-minded. They become more philosophical. And there's actually, for me, almost a universal marker of when this is happening, which is that they become actually very annoyed with their age mates for having concerns that feel to them very petty or minor. While grievance blows our concerns out of proportion, humility puts them in perspective. While grievance reduces the people with whom we disagree to caricature, humility acknowledges what Eboo Patel, the founder and president of Interfaith America, wrote in his 2022 book, We Need to Build. People are endlessly complex and fascinating. You can never tell simply from someone's group identity how they will experience the world, or know from their experience what conclusions they will draw. I watched only the first season of Apple TV's series Ted Lasso. After that, Life and other Apple TV, Netflix, and HBO Max shows got in the way. But like many other Americans, I adored it. I adored Ted, a man whose wife had moved on, whose heart is broken, whose new home of Britain is a bit of a mystery to him, whose new job as a soccer coach there is a setup for failure, and whose humble response is to try his hopeful best to turn all that around. The show's out of the gate conceit is that a protagonist inhabiting the stereotype of the blissful fool is wiser than the rest of us and has more to teach than to learn. Ted Lasso began streaming in 2020 when my Times colleague Margaret Renkl astutely observed, "We are all mired in an America we no longer recognize, a nation so dangerously polarized that many people would think nothing of cutting off their closest family members if they didn't vote the right way." And the show struck a nerve, Renkel added, because there was something about Ted Lasso's sunny optimism and faith in silliness as a social lubricant, something about his openness and his unshakable kindness that lifted Americans' pandemic worn hearts. Renkel recalled a particular scene in which Ted tells a player who is stewing over a defeat which animal is the happiest in the world. A goldfish. It's got a 10-second memory. By all reports, Ted Lasso grew darker as he and it aged, but maybe some subconscious premonition turned me away from the show before it could bring me down. Ted himself had a memory much longer than 10 seconds, as his pining for his wife proved. The thin paragon that he held up for the player is absurd, even dangerous. But the idea that we're too often held hostage by our grudges, too frequently fixated on what in our lives isn't exactly as we'd like it to be, there's indeed something there. An amalgam of kindness, openness, and silliness might be an effective solvent for grievance. We could try a dab of that. Or we could unhumbly cling to the conviction that we're singularly unappreciated and cruelly situated against hostile forces in a disintegrating world that compels us to wrest what we can while we can before it disintegrates even further. That's the road we've been on for a perilous while now. It's not too late to turn around. The end. Anybody has questions or comments, I'd be glad to entertain them. Carol. Amen. All I am and all I ever was is a fallible, redeemable human being. Is that, yeah. Anybody else? Joel. Mhm. Could everyone hear Joel's comment? Yeah. He said that one of the nice things about the forest in the 3 months that he and Chrissy have been here is that um, people are not competing with one another, but rather are supportive of one. I'm not quite getting it. Are supportive of one another, and that's very different from what he was used to in academia for many years before coming here. Did that capture it well enough? Yeah. 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 Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. Mhm. Okay. Thank you very much for coming. Mhm.